We're here at the National Botanic Gardens as part of the Dublin Book Festival, and I'm joined now by Niamh Fitzpatrick to talk about her book, Tell Me the Truth About Loss. Thanks for talking to me today about your own book.
You're welcome.
Part of the job, I suppose.
Yeah.
The book is very compelling. It's very touching. I think a lot of people who read it are going to be affected by it and helped by it as well. It details, I think we could say, three main parts of your life where grief played a huge role. But it struck me that a lot of people go through some of the experiences that you document in the book, but they don't all write their own books. So why did you write yours?
I had no intention of writing a book. This book is about three losses, as you say. The first one is my sister, Dara. She was Captain Dara Fitzpatrick. She died in the Irish Coast Guard Rescue 116 helicopter crash in March 14, 2017. And my marriage ended around the same time. And as I suppose the grief for Dara came in literally over me like a wave, I also began to realise that I had recognised these feelings of grief that I had grieved before in my life through infertility, but I'd never seen that as grief. I didn't recognise that as grief. So I suppose it was because the feelings were so great about Dara that I just had to understand them, had to figure them out. And I started thinking about grief and living that grief. And maybe it's from that I realised the grief around infertility, obviously the grief around the loss of a marriage, because grief isn't just about death, it's about loss and change. And it was from that maybe that the writing of the book came. But on the day that Dara died, she died, we were told about lunchtime that she died, and we had to go to Mayo to bring her body back. She had been recovered from the water. And I remember sitting in the car on the way, being driven up to Mayo to get Dara, and I took out my phone and I wrote 3 words, and it was vicious, violent and visceral. And they were the first 3 words actually of what turned out to be the book. And the reason I wrote them was that's what it felt like the moment hours earlier that we'd been told that Dara died. And it was, the only way I can describe it is a compulsion to put those 3 words down. And then over time, those words became sentences and paragraphs. And then I suppose the book evolved, really.
So was it a way of processing how you were feeling and a way of ordering your thoughts? And you might never have even published it, but it was a way of imposing structure on what was a violent kind of a tempest inside you.
Yeah, so, I'm 52 years of age. I'm a psychologist for nearly 30 years. I had never experienced anything like this. I have never experienced something like this. Grief is such a, I keep doing this. It's like a wave. It comes and it hits you and it overwhelms you physically, emotionally, cognitively, in every way. And so I suppose it's such a mess. You have to try and make sense of it. I did go to see a psychologist. Dara died under such traumatic circumstances, and I did go to see a psychologist. But I think the book, exactly as you said, had no one ever read this book, and had it never been published, it was something that I think I probably needed to do, because with the cumulative loss of the marriage and of my sister, there was such a need to try and process this. And maybe in the 1-hour sessions with the psychologist that were fantastic, I probably needed more. And I also think, you may remember, but you were doing a radio show on Today FM in 2017, and I was the agony aunt on your show. So we used to talk about people who, would have troubles in their life. And 6 weeks after Dara died, I was going back to work, and your show was the first thing I did going back to work. And that day, we didn't want to talk about somebody else's problems because all your listeners knew what had happened to me, where I'd been, that Dara was my sister. We had to address it. And so we just spoke about grief, and you let me talk honestly. And the response that we got at the station, I believe you got, and certainly I got, was immense. And people were saying, I'm not doing it wrong. I thought I wasn't coping. I thought I was losing my mind. But when I hear you talk to Neil about how you are struggling under the weight of this loss, it makes me realise that losing my mum, I am coping. This is just what grief feels like. And I think that was probably a reason to want to write this book, to say to people, grief is probably one of the most horrific things that we'll go through, I think, but that we can survive it and that there is hope after. That's really important. The hope word in this book is so important.
And you talk about different stages, and you describe it when you hear the news about Dara, that it's physical. It almost reads like there's a poltergeist or something. You say that when it first arrived, it was heavy, it was a painful weight, it was a very physical thing that you felt, and then it kind of moved to something else.
So we stood in Dara's kitchen when two men from her company came to tell us that the body that had been recovered was Dara's. And they had walked up the path, and as they walked up the path, my heart was beating so fast. But as they said those words, and I don't even remember what the words were, but I knew what they meant. As they said the words that let us know that Dara's was the body recovered, the first thing I felt was not an emotion. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical response. So I remembered my heart, it was just so heavy. My stomach dropped. It felt like as if the air went out of my lungs. And the weight on my chest, it was such a weight. I describe it, it was like, an elephant sitting on your chest. And it was as if my body registered her loss before my head did. Dara, it's not that she was my sister, she is my sister. But she and I were sisters here on earth for 45 years. And my body recognized that was gone, even before my head accepted that, or not accepted it, but even though my head registered it, it was physical first.
It's almost like a more primeval part of your brain. It's not even your brain, it's your body, it's your soul, it's your kind of essence realizes that there's an absence now.
Yeah.
But then that becomes a numbness. And you put forward a theory in the book that is to allow you to function.
Yeah, it was very strange. So after that initial huge response, I would have expected, if somebody told me beforehand that this was going to happen, I would have expected that I would have cried, I would have dropped to the ground. You would think any of those responses. But it was so bizarre because the first thing I noticed after the physical response was actually a numbness. And what the numbness, the best way I can describe this was, it was as if life then became looking through a glass window. So I was here, I could see the Gardaí coming, I could see the funeral directors, I could see everything, all the admin around grief and the funeral and all of those things. I could see that, but I was kind of removed from it because I was numb. And I've had a lot of people saying to me in the years since Dara died that they were worried that, my mum died or my brother died and I haven't cried. What's wrong with me? Well, maybe nothing's wrong with you. Maybe it's that your system is protecting you by having you numb so that it can slowly, little bit by little bit by little bit, help you understand that this person's not coming back. Because I think psychologically it's too big for us all at once.
It's a drip feed of realization, I suppose.
Yeah, because it's enormous. If you actually stop to think about the person, one of the people you love most in life, and that you never see them again, and that Dara doesn't exist anywhere except in my head or my heart. She just does not exist. She has no physical body. So if you think of the enormity of that, it's taken me 3 years to be able to say that to you without crying. So I think there's something about our system that with that numbness, that shock, it comes from shock, that it just releases the bits of information about she's not coming back. You can't ring her. She won't walk in the door. It releases that in small little pieces, and maybe they are more manageable. And that's how I saw the numbness as a help.
You mentioned that hope is very important in this book, and I wanted to go back to a phrase that is at the end of chapter 1, which is grief is survivable. Grief is survivable.
Yeah.
And you read that, and you, as a reader, you think, okay, that's good news. But then you immediately realize what you say in the book, that brings its own complications, because then you feel guilty that you won't feel this bad forever.
I think on some level we need the pain. I think when you're grieving for a loved one, that pain of their loss is a connection to them. So I was 3 years older than Dara, so my first memory in life is the day she was born, because I jumped into a pond in Herbert Park. My uncles took me and my sister, while my mum was in hospital having Dara, took us to a pond to feed the ducks, and apparently I said the ducks weren't coming to me, so I jumped into the pond. So I link that trauma and Dara's birth. But anyway, so she's my sister for all those years, and we sat around the table together before school, had breakfast, we went through our teens together, friends as adults. The idea that I can be okay that she's not here, it doesn't, it's like your head, these two places in your head. How can I love her so much, and how can I be okay that she's not here? And that's the bit around the maybe complexity of grief being survivable, because part of you doesn't want to survive it. You want to hurt so much because that means you're remembering that you love her so much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then the first time that you enjoy yourself, the first time you're not solely focused on something terrible that has happened, that brings its own, oh, I should be thinking about them 24 hours a day. But nobody can function like that for the rest of their lives.
And I think my own theory about grief is that if grief had a goal, it would be about learning to balance remembering and living. So it's not about getting over it. It's not about closure. It's not about moving on. It's not about any of that awful stuff. I don't want to move on. I don't want to leave Dara behind me. But I want to be able to remember her and also live my life. And I'm pretty sure that that's what Dara would want for me. So I think that's how I would see all that sort of piece.
Talk to me more about, you mentioned there and you mentioned it in the book as well, Dara's loss then puts context around previous feelings that you had over your fertility and then later the marriage breakdown.
Yeah, I think it made me realise that years earlier, not having been able to have children, having tried to have children and gone through IVF and adoption, that the feelings I felt then were almost an echo of what I was feeling with Dara. So, with Dara, grief is not just about sadness, it's about rage, it's about loneliness, it's about envy, all of those things. And I suppose years earlier, on a much quieter level, the grief with Dara feels really loud, feels really overwhelming, whereas it was a much quieter grief around the fertility. And I'm not really sure hugely why that was, but the feelings were there and were really strong, but their presence was quieter, I think. And so, but I recognized them as I started to feel the rage with Dara and her loss. I started to feel, you see somebody else who would have a sister and you were envious of them. And one of the things I suppose as a psychologist is that bit around knowing that our feelings are normal, even those what I call the ugly feelings, and it's easy to be all right with joy and all those lovely things, but what about envy? What about rage? What about resentment? And I noticed as I felt them with Dara, but I knew they were normal to feel them with Dara, I noticed that these sounded familiar and felt familiar and that I'd had them before when we had gone through that issue around trying to have a family. But I'd never named it as then because nobody had died. It was an infertility. It wasn't a miscarriage, it was an infertility. So there wasn't a sense of loss around death. But now I began to realise, but that was grief.
Grief is about loss, and it could be a loss of a person or it could be loss of what you imagine your future to be. And that's what was the case in that situation.
Yes, because with infertility, and you get to the point where you realise that you're not going to become a parent, you have to change your life. You have to reimagine your life. You have to see yourself a different person than the person that you were going to be.
Do you think, because that is usually a private grief, and most people, particularly as you detailed in the book, but you also spoke about this in the radio show, this was a public grieving for Dara. Do you think that the private grief is more difficult to deal with than public grief, or is it just different?
I think they're different, not more difficult, I think they're different. I think what happens with the private grief, or what I call a secret loss. So when people go into the office or maybe now in COVID times, not so much in an office, but people are dealing with people in the workplace. You know, somebody might have had a miscarriage at the weekend, somebody's marriage might be over, maybe somebody has had to put, say for instance, a parent into a nursing home, and there's different losses in life, and for a lot of those, they go on without others knowing about them. They're quite secret. Whereas when somebody dies, there is a funeral, there is an acknowledgement of that pain. So I think those secret losses can be harder only in that maybe there isn't an acknowledgement of the pain, and maybe there isn't the support around that you will have with a public loss like a death, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it makes sense. Would your advice be to people who are either employees going back having been through something like this, or employers taking them back?
I think if you are in a workplace, or if you could be in a sports team, you could be in a community group, in any sort of group that you're going back to after bereavement loss. I think you have to think about, what have I learned about loss? What have I learned about grief? What have I learned about me? What have I learned that I might like or not like? I mean, when you walk back into a workplace, for example, do you want your work colleagues to give their condolences? They might have been at the funeral, but do you want them to mention? Do you want them to ask you how you are? Or do you want them to just let you get on with it? And so maybe talking to somebody, a colleague who, for instance, who you could speak to, who can sort of pave the way for you a little bit, that can be kind of good. Another thing that's important if you're going back to work or into any group is allow yourself to be human and do what you do. So a big fear for anybody is, will I cry? What if I cry? What if I break down in front of my teammates or my colleagues or my peers? But it's about allowing yourself to do that and saying, look, it's normal, it's okay. I went into my first corporate meeting after Dara died, and instead of shaking the hand of the senior manager I was meeting, I hugged him.
Right.
Because
what was the reaction?
We both got a fright.
Okay.
Yeah. I think what it was I was so used to being hugged. It was like the whole of Ireland, I suppose, had hugged us after Dara died, and I was so used to being hugged, and that's all I knew. And then when I met him, I didn't know what else to do, and so I just instinctively hugged him. But I said to myself, you've been through this over this last 6-7 weeks, what else? And we laughed it off, and it was okay. You have to allow yourself to do that. I think if you're an employer, or if you're maybe a manager or a team, and you have somebody coming back in who's bereaved, and with COVID now, there's going to be a lot of that. I think you have to think about, say, what could we put in place to help this person? And one of the biggest things is ask them, what do you need? Do you need people to acknowledge it? Do you need people to say nothing? And maybe from an employer's point of view, do you have programs around death or loss or grief? And in those programs, do you talk about the secret loss that some people will have? And it's not about a spotlight on miscarriage or a spotlight on any of those other losses. It's about an awareness within the organisation that there may be some people walking amongst you who have a loss that you just don't know about. So just be kind and just think, So I think there are things we can do.
When you went back to doing psychological sessions, because this was such a public grief for Dara, did you have to have the talk with the clients? Did you have to, because normally a client doesn't know anything about a psychologist or knows very little about them. Did you have to put them at their ease, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, if somebody comes to me for anxiety or depression or stress or whatever the issue is, or sports issues, because I deal with that too, they don't need to know what's going on in my life. My house can be burning down and it's nothing to do with them. I'm there to help them. But people knew that Dara was my sister, so I had to address it. And when people came for sessions, women were incredible. We're sitting in the beautiful botanic gardens with flowers all around us, and I could have opened a florist with the shops. Women came to the door with flowers. I would say every female client brought me flowers, and it was so. They hugged me. They stood at the door. They gave me the flowers. They hugged me. You would never do any of that in a normal situation. And then we came in, and I said straight off, look, normally what is going on in my life has got no place here. But we both know what has happened. Let me tell you. And I explained to them that I was seeing a psychologist who specialises in trauma. and that I have been doing that. I'd had a lot of time off work, and that I was very well supported, and that I was fully present, and that no matter what they wanted to say to me, I was here and ready to hear it. And immediately I saw this.
Relief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shoulders dropped, breath let out, and they said to themselves, it's okay, whatever my thing is, I can tell her. She's here and she'll be okay. And then we got on with the sessions, and I
You
think...
go further than that, though. You say grief made me better in a professional sense.
I think so. I think for starters, maybe I should, if that's what I've written, because it's a while since I've written the book, if that's what I've written, then what I probably should say is that surviving grief made me better. Surviving hearing that Dara died made me better. Because what it does is it changes the landscape of your life. Life is different now. Life looks different, and nothing's the same. I'm not the same, and life's not the same. So I don't waste any time. I can sort of cut through things. I'm not afraid to say things or wary of saying things. And also I think it almost enriches the empathy that you have for somebody else. So when I see somebody in front of me who's in pain, I would always have had great compassion and empathy for them. But there's something different in terms of the layers that grief brought to that with me. And I think I knew it, but I think my clients know it. Because so many times people will say to me, I know you'll get this.
Right.
And I think with a person who's in pain, what they need is to be heard. So if they're sitting in front of somebody who they feel will hear their pain and understand their pain, that makes them feel some sense of hope that they can be something else other than in pain all the time.
And did you seek out psychological works about grief? Did you take an academic or almost cerebral approach to go, I'm just going to look at all the research, I'm going to read as many books as I possibly can to see how any of this affects me? No.
No, I have a degree in psychology and 2 masters, and I did not go near one paper or one book. I've not read one book on grief. I wanted to know from people who walk in my shoes. I needed to know what it would be like and if it would be survivable. And I remember we had Dara's funeral on a Saturday, and on the Monday, 2 days later, I went to Mayo to see Blackrock where she died. And I remember that night having seen Blackrock Island, it was just horrifying seeing it for the first time. So that night I couldn't sleep. And I did what they tell you not to do, but I'm really glad I did. I got onto Google and I just started Googling about grief, and I came across a woman called Megan Devine, and she was a psychotherapist. She was a psychotherapist, and her partner had died in front of her. He drowned in front of her, and she gave up psychotherapy and moved into the grief space. And she wrote one line that I literally read 2 days after Dara's funeral, and it shaped my whole path. And the line is, some things in life cannot be fixed, they can only be carried. And I knew then that what I had to do was to not try and make this better. I wasn't going to make myself feel better. I wasn't going to fix this. This wasn't going to be okay. What I needed to do was I needed to learn to somehow carry the loss of Dara in my life. And that was what I needed more than an academic paper. I do want to study grief. I would like to look at it. See, even look what I do here. Grief is so physical. I'm aware I keep doing this, but I feel that I need more space. Dara's only died 3 years, and I think I need more space before I'm ready to look at theories and all of that.
You talked about COVID there, and I think this is very relevant in COVID times. And for people who have lost somebody unexpectedly or in an accident, they can sometimes tend to imagine the last moments of their loved one, which is, were they in pain, were they conscious, were they not conscious? And that can be an image that haunts people, and it haunted you for a long time. How did you deal with that? Because you do detail sitting with the image and acknowledging that it is in your head. You can't just ignore it.
Yeah, until we got the facts, I probably spent 6, 7, 8 weeks not knowing if Dara was on her own in the dark of night on the coast of Mayo, alive and frightened. And I think those images were truly, they were just horrifying. But I didn't know the facts. We found out later that she had died before she got to the surface of the water. She didn't make it up from the bottom. So that image was banished once I knew that fact. But until then, it literally haunted me. So what I did was, I suppose I understood as a psychologist, and this is maybe where the psychology has helped me, I understood that there's a difference between thoughts and images and facts. And I understood that this was in my head, but that it didn't mean that it was true. It didn't mean that that's what happened to her. I understood that actually whatever I left go in my head as images would impact my emotional state. So if I kept playing on loop that image of Dara on her own in the water, frightened at night, knowing her fate, that actually that would probably fell me. So I knew that. So what I did was, I actually just reminded myself to stay in the present. So I would say to myself, well, you know, Niamh, can you be sure that that's true? Do you know 100% that that's what happened to her? And of course then I was able to say, well, no, I'm terrified that's what happened to her, but I don't know that. And that helped a bit. There's also a thing that we do sometimes, it's you get somebody to look at 3 things they can see, 3 things they can hear, and 3 things they can touch. So sometimes if my head was really full with that image, I'd bring myself back into the present. So if I was doing this here, I would look around these beautiful gardens, the walled garden that we're in, and I would think about, you know, I'd pick out maybe 3 flowers I hadn't noticed before and really see them. And 3 things I can hear and 3 things I can feel, like the wind in my hair. Yeah. And when I do that, it brings me right back to the present. And then I would bring myself back to the present by saying, whatever happened with Dara, she is not suffering now. So even if that horrifying thought had been the facts, which it wasn't, but if it had been the facts, that she was almost safe now. And I think the psychology just helped me manage those horrifying images and thoughts in my head by being able to acknowledge them, but not get stuck in them that way.
What do you want people to take from the book? Is it that line, grief is survivable? Is it that you will change, but that there is hope?
Very much hope. I mean, the chapters 15 and 16 and the afterword are so full of hope. I'm not saying skip the rest of the book and only read that, but they're so full of hope. And it's funny, when you read this book, you can almost, I wrote it as I lived it. So you can see the language I use in the beginning, you can feel the feelings in the beginning, and then as we come in, probably the last chapters I wrote maybe 2.5 coming up on 3 years after Dara's death, and you can see the difference in language and you can feel the hope coming through. And I want somebody to be able to do that, to take that hope. And I'd love them to be able to realise that they are normal and it is okay however you feel, even those ugly feelings are okay. And I'd also love them to think that if you can link the feelings of grief with love, like when you rage, why are you raging? I'm raging because I'll never see, and I don't mean raging in that way, I mean raging because I'll never see her face again. I'll never hear her voice. You know, when somebody dies, they almost become still in your mind, and it becomes harder sometimes to hear their voice, and there's such anger about that. And so for somebody to realise that, though that anger is because of that love, if you can read this book and realise it, if somebody you love has died and you feel all these awful feelings, bring it back to the love you have for them.
It's definitely hopeful. At the end, you talk about the clarity that something horrific happening gives you. You talk about the things that you don't care about anymore, that are irrelevant. You talk about YouTube and Instagram and all that sort of stuff, and you know, you're not worried about body image. You are thinking about it is now easier to cut through all that nonsense because you have clarity.
Yeah, you know, especially bereavement loss, I think your world just becomes clear. I describe it as if it's like in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy comes out of the black and white movie and into the
Technical,
colour,
yeah.
exactly, because you see things more clearly, you see what matters. What I now know doesn't matter, so I don't care about being perfect. I don't care about being liked. I mean, we all want to be liked and we all care on some level, but I wouldn't let that guide my world, I suppose. I'm not afraid of failure, I'm not afraid of living, I'm not afraid of dying.
Not afraid of saying no.
I'm not afraid of saying no, absolutely. And things that, so, you know, what you were saying there about the Instagrams and the YouTube. So, you know, we live in a world that's very image conscious. So with the physicality of grief, it didn't only end when I, you know, found out about Dara dying, but I've struggled with, you know, immune system. I've struggled, I've had pneumonia, I've been in hospital a year or so on steroids, gained a lot of weight, so body doesn't look like it would have done before. And so now I realise I don't care about that. When I'm ready, I'm not able. I'm just not, sometimes you're just not able to get out of bed. Never mind go back to the gym and do the kettlebells and the runs. So I'm not able to do that. But there would have been a time where that would have really bothered me. And now I think I've learned to live with the fact that Dara died the way she died. I can handle anything. So if anybody looks at me and goes, well, she's a bit chunky now, isn't she? I'm not really bothered. You know, there's things that would definitely have, as a woman, would have really been a problem before. I say, for instance, from the physical perspective, I see my body in terms of function. So I think, well, I can hug people I love. Not in COVID times, but close people I love.
In your bubble.
In my bubble, I can hug people I love. I can listen to those. I can listen to my clients. I can, you know, share things. So the body is more about what it can do than what it looks like. And the perspective, that's what came from grief, that perspective. Do you know?
I might ask you to read a part of the book. I was going to ask you to read the part about how you talk about how physical grief is at the start, but I think you should possibly read the last bit, which is hopeful about, because that is the bit, because we've come full circle now, that it's so hopeful that this is the body that allows you to hug Fionn. It's the body that allows you to listen to your clients. It's the body that allows you to live the life you're living now.
It's the body that enables me to have that moment with Fionn, to cheer him on at his first day at school when his mama wasn't there, to read to him, listen to his stories of how his day went, hear him tell me that he loves me and tell him that I love him back. This body enables me to listen to clients and hear their stories and help them through the therapy process. It lets me spend time with my family and friends doing the everyday things that connect us and make us happy.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for being like the book, which is open and honest and compelling and truthful and touching. And I think it's going to help a lot of people. I also think Ireland seems to do grief okay. I think we do it reasonably well. So thank you.
You're welcome.